Welcome to the CEIBS Knowledge Meets Management webinar series. This series has been designed by the Zurich campus of CEIBS in order to help promote the research that our professors in Shanghai are doing. A lot of times, our professors are working on research that is very directly related to management. Sometimes it's not. We try to bring this connection back together to ensure that the research that our professors are doing is somewhat understandable for management, even though the incentives aren't always there to show that. Today, my name is Robert Straw. I'm the CEO of the CEIBS Zurich campus, responsible for CEIBS Europe operations. It's my pleasure to have you here today, and our speakers, CEIBS Professor Andrew Wang. He will present how our leaders can model ethical conduct effectively in different cultures. Professor Wang will be joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Eelco Fiole, during the panel discussion. Professor Wang is an associate professor of management. He's a CEIBS program co-director of the Leadership Development Program at CEIBS, a very important program, executive program that we run. Prior to joining CEIBS, he worked at the Institute for Human Resource Management at the National Sun Yat-sen University in Taiwan as an associate professor. He holds a PhD in industrial organizational psychology from National Taiwan University that he finished about 12 years ago. His research interests mainly focus on Chinese organizational behavior, Chinese leadership styles and their effects, Western leadership theories and their cultural boundaries, gender and leadership, and change recipients' responses towards organizational change. This is important for us in the Zurich campus. We often go like this as we're talking. Our job here is to be a bridge builder between cultures, management styles, leadership styles across these borders in order to further enhance the business relationships between Europe, the world, and China. Dr. Fiole, he's a founding and managing partner at Alpha Governance Partners. He's been doing this for about 10 years as well. It's focusing on governance for sustainable and digital investment management globally. He's an adjunct professor of financial ethics at both the universities of Neuchâtel and in Lausanne here in Switzerland. He's a risk governance expert with current board mandates in social impact, sustainability, tokenization, and so forth. We welcome him to be a panelist, to listen in and comment on Professor Wang's inputs. Professor Wang, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule in Shanghai. I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Robert Straw. And let me share my screen first. So hopefully you can see my screen clearly.
Yes, great.
Okay. So good evening here and good afternoon there. And it's my honor to present research findings of one of my research articles recently published in Journal of Management Studies. In this research, we would like to examine leaders' promotion of ethical actions as a culture-embedded concepts. And we try to do a cross-cultural comparison between Taiwan and the States. So I would like to begin this presentation with a little activity. So imagine that Jamie is a manager of a real estate brokerage company, and I will show you two passages. So please tell me in which passage that Jamie is a more ethical person. So there are two passages, and their structures are actually quite similar, but they denote different kinds of ethical behaviors. And I will show passage A first, and several seconds later, passage B would follow. Okay, so for all the audience, you don't have to answer my question, but you can actually type A or B in the chatting area. Then I'll know your opinion about this, okay? So this is passage A, and later you will see passage B. So in which passage you see Jamie as a more ethical person, passage A or passage B? So if you have your answer, you can type your answer in the chatting area, then I will see it clearly. So the two passages are about one common leadership strategy of promoting ethical actions in the workplace. So this strategy, we call it role modeling. So for passage A, you can see high levels of role modeling. And in passage B, that's low levels of role modeling. So right now, no one typed your answer in the chatting area, but I assume that most of you would choose passage A because generally we think that role modeling behavior is an effective strategy to promote ethical actions. So if you demonstrate that behavior and you do it, then that's a good promotion strategy for you to convey ethical message at work. And here comes the other two passages. So you can also try to evaluate in which passage Jamie is a more ethical person. Here, we'd like to talk about another promotion strategy called ethical guidance. So you can show it by your behavior, you can serve as a role model, but you can also try to build an ethical standard by communicate with your followers. So you can establish the standards and try to reinforce them with rewards and punishments. So most of the time in the context of business ethics, I would say it's more likely to be punishments. So you see something it is wrong, and you try to show that it is incongruent with the ethical standards that you would like to promote. So you try to do something about it, and you communicate with followers explicitly. So that's ethical guidance. So in passage A, that's high levels of ethical guidance. And in passage B, that's low levels of ethical guidance. So both role modeling and ethical guidance, they are common strategies that leaders may use when they try to promote ethical actions at work. And in this research, we try to argue based on a moralization perspective that the enactment of ethical leadership is positively moralized only when followers perceive the enactment behavior as morally right. That is, although followers, they may see your promotion behavior as legitimate, but they will compare between the behavior and their moral foundations. So if there is a congruence between the perceived behavior and moral foundations, then the behavior would be positively moralized. But if there is less congruence between the two, then probably they will not positively moralize the perceived behaviors. So for Western societies, both ethical guidance and role modeling, they are congruent with the Western moral foundations. So both of them would be useful leadership strategies when leaders try to promote ethical actions at work. But we try to argue that in Eastern societies such as Taiwan, maybe role modeling is more important. And ethical guidance may not be as effective as role modeling because ethical guidance may be less congruent with one very important cultural traditions called Taoism-oriented ethical ideals. Okay, so what is Taoism-oriented ethical ideals? Culture is a very complicated concept. So we can use lotus and use it as a metaphor. So flower is the part of the lotus that catch the most attention. So it means the service level representations of culture. It's about what you eat, what you wear, where you live. So it's all about concrete objects. And culture can also be about our behaviors. For example, if you shake hands with Westerners, you can feel at least a little bit strength or power from the handshake grip. But if you shake hands with Chinese people, for example, they may just touch your hands with little power and strength. So that is also a part of culture. And pop culture is also related to your values, your belief, your ideologies, or the social norms. And at a deep level, culture is about human nature, interpersonal relationships, or patterns of thinking. So Taoism, it is about architecture in the Chinese context, and it's also about lifestyles or religions or arts or how you conceive the idea of faith. And it is also about how you perceive the world or your deep level beliefs. And one of the most important deep level beliefs is humility. Okay, so humility is a very important concept in Taoism. So what is humility? Today, it is not my intention to talk about politics, and it is quite sensitive for Taiwanese to talk about politics. But this is a very good example regarding the importance of Taoism-oriented ethical ideals in Taiwan. So just 1 hour after a spectacular election victory was confirmed, a very famous Taiwanese political leader claimed this to the supporters. So we win the election, but we need to be humble, and more humble. So you can see that Taoism is almost everywhere in Taiwan, and it has been socialized for centuries. Okay, so what is Taoism-oriented ethical ideals in terms of leadership? Maybe the best illustration is this old saying, good walkers leave no tracks. It means that individuals with superior morality should carry out the highest level of goodness anonymously. So they do it and they do it at a very high level, but they do not engage in activities that have the potential to amplify their reputation in public. Okay, so that's the first important thing about Taoism-oriented ethical ideals. And the second one, behaviors such as pointing out others' faults in order to reveal that I'm really good in public, may be interpreted unfavorably in society that embrace Taoism. Okay, so based on Taoism-oriented ethical ideals, we hypothesize that in Taiwan, maybe leaders who are high in role modeling but low in ethical guidance should receive a higher levels of moral evaluation from the followers than do those high in both. But in the States, we expect that leaders high in both should get the highest moral evaluation. So to test this hypothesis, we collected 2 independent samples, and the Taiwanese samples, they were recruited online. So this sample consisted of 147 Taiwanese working adults. And we also have another US sample consisting of 157 working adults. So based on the demographic information, you can see that there are a bit difference between the 2 samples. So we actually control for all the demographics in the meta-analysis, and we ask respondents to rate role modeling behavior, ethical guidance behavior, and moral evaluation of their immediate supervisors. So in this study, we use latent profile analysis to identify major groups underlying all the respondents. So this analysis suggests that there were 5 meaningful groups underlying the samples. So you can see that about 2/3 of the respondents, they belongs to group 3, which means their immediate supervisor have high levels of role modeling behavior and also high levels of ethical guidance behavior. And there are about 20% of them, they had low levels of role modeling behavior and high levels of ethical guidance behavior. That's the way their immediate supervisors were. And we have 2 low group 1 and group 2 together. They represent about 12% of the respondents, and only 4% of the respondents, they had high role modeling and low ethical guidance leaders. So in this study, we actually were interested in group 3 and group 5. So group 3, you can say that they are say more, do more leaders, and group 5, they are say less, do more leaders. So you can see that in the Taiwanese sample, in terms of moral evaluation as the outcome, group 5, the high RM, low EG group, actually got the highest moral evaluation, 4.29. And group 3, they got the second highest, 3.91. And these 2 were not significantly different in the Taiwanese group. And for the US sample, the highest one is group 3, 4.05, and it was significantly different from the second highest, which is the group 5, 3.49. So based on the results, I would say, regardless of cultural settings, in Taiwan and in US, both say more, do more, and say less, do more can be considered valid strategies for promoting ethical actions. And the lack of ethical guidance does not necessarily downgrade leaders' moral status in Taiwan. Okay, so it's a little bit different from our expectation, because in the Taiwanese sample, the mean of group 5 and that of group 3, they were not significantly different from each other. So we have 2 possible explanations for that. First one, in this study, we use generalized moral evaluation as our outcome. So if we choose, for example, humility as our outcome, maybe we can observe a significant difference in Taiwan. And second, in this study, we actually asked respondents to rate their immediate supervisors, and we actually observed a high correlations between role modeling and ethical guidance. So that's natural that we observe a majority group 3, about 2/3 of them because the two indicators are highly correlated. So in the next study, we try to manipulate the two leadership strategies and we try to see their impacts on two different outcomes. So, because in terms of Taoism-oriented ethical ideals, you see that individuals with superior morality, they should be humble. They should not do it in public. So we try to change our outcome. This time we focus on perceived leader humility. So we hypothesize that ethical guidance may have negative effects on perceived leader humility. And again, in Taiwan, we expect leaders high in role modeling but low in ethical guidance to obtain higher perceived leader humility than do those high in both. And we expect this kind of effects disappear in the US. And also, we expect humble leaders to be more compassionate. So they don't want to reveal others' faults because they want to show that they are better than others. So if you interact with humble leaders, you may not feel depleted. You may not feel emotionally exhausted. Okay, so that's our following two hypotheses. We expect that ethical guidance in Taiwan may have a positive effect on follower depletion, and followers of leaders high in both role modeling and ethical guidance, they are actually more depleted than those of leaders high in role modeling but low in ethical guidance. So in some hypotheses in the study 2 actually show that ethical guidance may have an unfavorable effects on perceived leader humility and follower depletion. So we again collect two independent samples. Our Taiwanese samples consisted of 213 working adults, and the US sample consisted of 243 working adults. And this time, their demographic information are much more similar. So in this study, we actually utilize the scenarios that I present in the beginning of this presentation. So we have two passages for role modeling behavior and another two passages for ethical guidance behaviors. And the combination of these passages can generate 4 different conditions. So we can have high conditions, high-low, low-high, and low-low conditions. And all the respondents were randomly assigned to read one of the scenarios, and they rated how would they respond to the hypothetical leader in the scenario. So here, you see the main results of study 2. So we have 2 different outcomes. The first outcome would be perceived leader humility. So in the Taiwanese sample, the high-low group, high role modeling, low ethical guidance group, got the highest evaluation regarding perceived leader humility, 3.6. And the second highest is high group, 3.0. And the other two got the lower evaluations regarding humility. But in the US sample, you can see that both high group and high-low group, they got the highest ratings about perceived leader humility. So this is consistent with our hypothesis. And for the likelihood of follower depletion, you can see that in the Taiwanese sample, the lowest rating goes to the high-low group, 2.33. And it is noteworthy that high and low group got similar ratings. So the low group, 3.27, it actually means that the leader did nothing. And the high group actually means that the leader did almost everything. But you can see that there was no difference between the two groups. So it is actually quite interesting. And in the US sample, again, you can see that both high group and high-low group, they got similar, the lowest ratings in this sample. So basically, it means that in the Taiwanese sample, the high-low group, high role modeling and low ethical guidance combination, actually it leads to the highest level of perceived leader humility and the lowest level of follower depletion. But in the US sample, the only factor that can affect the outcomes is role modeling, and ethical guidance is unrelated to the two outcomes. So based on the results of the two studies, we would say ethical guidance is a culture-embedded construct. And in Taiwan, leaders do not identify ethical guidance as an effective strategy of promoting ethical action at work because the combined use of role modeling and ethical guidance actually introduces a paradox because the use of ethical guidance is less congruent with the Taoism-based moral foundations of Taiwanese people. So researchers need to be cautious when they use Western ethical leadership constructs to examine the ethical leadership phenomena in non-Western settings. So the Western ethical leadership theories, they would suggest that both role modeling and ethical guidance are effective strategies for promoting ethical actions, but maybe say less, do more leaders may be more welcome at least in Taiwan. So our findings reveal the need for valid ethical leadership skills that separate ethical guidance from role modeling. So the most widely used ethical leadership skill is a unidimensional skill, which means that there are items for role modeling and there are items for ethical guidance, but we actually collect them into a single indicator. And this may not be the best situation when you would like to investigate ethical leadership in non-Western settings. And for practical implications, leaders need to take cultural factors into consideration when they attempt to promote workplace ethics. So in Taiwan, maybe the say less, do more leaders should be the most ideal one. So maybe managers should not engage in over-reliance on ethical guidance. So one effective strategy is that if they really need to communicate with their followers about ethical standards, or maybe they need to reinforce the consequence of violating the ethical standards, maybe they can find appropriate surrogates. For example, some Taiwanese organizations, they try to hire chief ethical officers. So with this kind of executives in the organizations, maybe first-line managers, they can be more comfortable to do say less, do more leaders, and that may be helpful. And for expats in Taiwan, maybe they are less influenced by the Taoism-based judgment, but they should be aware of this culture tradition. So if they can do it, maybe they can also try to be, say, let's do more leaders when they lead Taiwanese subordinates. And that would lead to favorable outcomes. So in this study, we actually try to try to highlight the cultural difference between East and West. I think cultural difference can be observed quite obviously at beach. So Western people and Eastern people would do different things at beach, but they may also respond to ethical leaders' action differently because of different cultural foundations and moral foundations. So maybe we need to consider this when you would like to promote ethical actions and convey ethical messages when you are interacting with, at least Taiwanese followers or Taiwanese employees, and that may lead to better results. So this basically concludes my presentation, and I would like to save more time for our discussion. So I'm open to Dr. Eelco's comments, and I also welcome our audience to ask questions. And I'm very happy to answer the questions. Thank you. Professor Robert, maybe you're on mute.
Sorry. Fascinating research. Thank you very much. It's so rich in content. Before I hand it over to Eelco, I would like to again reiterate what you just said. If you have a question, if you're in the audience and you have a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and type it in there so that when we get to the Q&A in a few minutes, we can have some of those questions. Eelco, the floor is yours. How would you respond to the results?
Yeah, it is fascinating, fascinating research, and I think clearly indicates some very good advice for those expats that are going to Asia, or specifically Chinese cultured Asia, to try and be how to try and be successful. We've known many horror stories, of course, where Westerners go to Asia and completely fail. Part of the reason is that they don't understand the cultural context that they're getting themselves into. So I think there was very, very good advice coming out. Like you, Rob, my brain also went in all directions. I was thinking about the relationship to psychology. I was thinking about the relationship to the Western schools of thought, which I think in the West we ourselves have departed a bit from. But I was also wondering about if it makes a difference if a culture is homogeneous. If I look at the US, it is not that homogeneous. We've had the US has a proud history of immigrants and so on, and as a result, it is less homogeneous. I was wondering, how does this relate to, for example, Europe, where cultures are a little bit more homogeneous, not on a European level, but on a country level. An Italian will speak differently than a Frenchman and different from a German. So if I think about humility as an important concept in Taoism, I also find that very important. But I guess I find it important from a more Aristotelian virtue ethics type of basis, where I would say humility is anyway a virtue that Aristotle already asked us to practice. And so I think that some of the ideas that were brought as being also in strengths are also reflected in some of the Western thinking, but maybe in the West we have diverged quite a bit from it. I'm certain that we can explore this a little bit in the conversation. So in short, I think for those Westerners in the audience, very good advice, and should help us, creating more awareness of what it is that we're trying to do and how we want to deal when we venture out into Chinese-speaking Asia.
Thank you, Eelco. Thank you very much. We've got a bunch of questions coming in. I'm going to start with the base question. Does culture and traditions like Taoism and Christianity in the West and the East, or Buddhism in areas, does it still play a role, and how, to what extent, in contemporary organizations, and which type of organizations? That would be a first question for you, Professor.
Thank you, Robert. I just showed the picture of lotus. So there are flowers, leaves, and there are roots. So basically, psychologists would assume that the flowers, they are variable, but the roots are relatively stable. So I would say if it's about what you eat, what you wear, where you live, then it is variable. But there are some cultural roots. I think it is quite stable. So for example, there is a Chinese term called 默契, and I think it is very difficult to be translated in English because it is so culture embedded. So basically, it means I want to say something, but I didn't say it. And I didn't say it, but you get it. Then we have 默契. So that's a high context communication style. And I would say maybe for Generation Z in the Chinese context, they still value 默契. So maybe for daily conversations, now they prefer direct communications. They prefer you to say it out loud. But if it is about something really important, it is about how we interact with others. It is about the basic functions of this hierarchy, this societal hierarchy. Then I think maybe for younger generations, they still value 默契. So I would say humility, again, is at the roots of the cultural system. So it has been socialized for decades, for centuries, I would say. So it's a part of the society. So I would say maybe just like 默契, humility is also a very important foundation of Chinese culture. And at least I can observe it quite clearly in the Taiwanese society. So maybe some kind of cultural elements, they may fade away, but there would be something that is in the roots of cultural system. And it is very important. You can still observe it very clearly in contemporary organizations. That's my opinion.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it make sense for us to have more cultural training, especially in global or multinational firms?
Yeah, I think it would be helpful. So you don't have to understand 默契 100%, but you may need to be aware that for Chinese people, or maybe for Japanese as well, 默契 is very important. So if they deliberately hide something not to say and try to ask you to evaluate based on the context, then that may be something really important. And if you would like to lead and would like to promote ethical actions, maybe the way you show it is far more important than the way you say it. Yeah, so I think if you can have this kind of awareness, then that would be helpful.
But we say that in the West all the time. It's not what you say, it's how you say it, right? It's the how is so much more important than, or just as much as important as the what. When I think about this 默契, and I think about Stewart leadership, which focuses very much on humility of a Christian concept or Aristotelian concept. These are all, the overlap is amazing. The overlap is quite significant. So it comes to another question. Are there some things that we would consider in the roots of your lotus tree? Maybe it's an oak tree in Europe, right? Maybe it's a lotus in Asia, but those roots, are there any such thing as universal values?
I would say if you observe the behavioral aspects, you can see many differences. But maybe at the roots, there are some commonalities. So, for example, Chinese people think humility is very important. And I think Western people would also say humility is very important. But maybe there would be some fundamental differences. For example, when we talk about ethical leadership in the Eastern culture, it's about not abusing your power because there is less legal system, there may not be concrete regulations. So we rely on the leader to make the final fair judgments. So ethical leadership is about not abusing your power. But in Western society, maybe it's about the protection of individual rights. So I think the same thing happens for humility. So for Chinese people, it's about how the most powerful person acts in front of others. But maybe it would be different in Europe. So maybe for the lotus, it has this kind of components. For the oak tree, it also has this kind of components. But lotus and oak trees are different.
Right.
Maybe I can describe
Sure. Eelco, any comments on this?
Yeah, the question, are there any universal values? I think that individuals, we can all see and feel injustice when we see it happen. And so we feel injustice, we feel outrage when something is not good. We also feel admiration if we see something is really done well. I think even that we can say that we recognize this irrespective of where we come from. Having said that, how it is then framed is maybe a different story. A leader abusing power is also frowned upon, if you will, in the West, in my mind, as well as in other parts of the world. Lots of the values, not only the values, but also what are permitted actions, allowed actions, positive and negative actions. These are also, say, defined in Western schools of thought. But as I say, I think we strayed a bit, away from it because we have been thinking that we can cover everything in laws and say, as long as it's in law, then we know for certain what is allowed, and for the rest it's unclear. So we have this doubt. So we just look at the law and then that's it, and forget that not everything which is legal is also ethical. In advanced societies, you would hope that the distance between ethical and legal is small, but sometimes it's actually not so small. And then I agree with Andrew. Then we rely on leadership to make a judgment, which we hope which is fair. Fairness as being, in terms of comparison, fair in relation to what we need to ask ourselves. And that is something that you need to increase, generally speaking, the awareness of fairness. The beauty, I think, with the Taiwan example or the Taoist example is that you have a strong culture which can reinforce and help people relate to principles, whereas in the West we've, as I said, we've strayed away of maybe Christian or other notions a bit, and as a result we have less strict, less reference to values. I think in the West we tend to forget that 70–80%, I don't have the exact number, I think 6 of 7 or 7 out of 8 people globally associate themselves with some form of religion, i.e. whether values which are important, instead of just moving away to purely secular points of view. And so this is important. I think that it will regain ground, in fact, on this side of the planet.
There's one comment that comes in. Cultural dimensions have been discussed for years. So it's one of these things where actually we're never going to have enough understanding. We could have this type of discussion once a week, actually, for the rest of our lives, and we're never actually going to be on top of it because context changes, the nuances are so rich. And I've done a lot of cultural training in my history in the past too, and it's firms and individuals and even myself and we are never going to be at the top of our game, because I haven't been in that context, in that situation ever before, and it's very often the case that I'm going to make a mistake then, because I don't understand the full, deeper cultural context going on. So that's one of the reasons why, yes, we've been talking about this for decades, but I don't think we can talk about it enough. Any comments from you about that?
I think this is great for researchers.
Yeah.
That means we can have a lot of interesting topics going on. Yeah. And I think maybe from the perspective on cross-cultural psychology, it is about to have better understanding of cultural settings that you are less familiar with.
Right.
So I'm not saying that you need to have, say, at least 80% of the understanding of a different culture, but maybe 30% is more than zero.
Right.
40% is more than 30%. And it can actually increase the effectiveness of communication or maybe the function of your organization, significantly. Yeah. So I think we still don't know a lot, I think. So I'm Taiwanese and I'm specialized in Chinese leadership, but I would say my understanding of Chinese leadership is only at the beginning. Yeah, but previously we would say we have almost zero understanding regarding Chinese leadership, but not because 90% of the current theories are from the West. So I think there are stages. So in the beginning, we try to identify the major differences. And then we try to explain the major differences. Then we can develop a theory, an indigenous theory for the less familiar culture. So maybe we're right now in the middle of stage 1 and stage 2. So we always discover new differences, but maybe we can try to identify the underlying mechanisms or underlying logic about culture. Then we can have a new theory about it. So I think there's still a long way to go.
Thank you. We have one question coming in. It says, what would you recommend Taiwanese or Asian leaders working in the West and leading Western Europeans to do?
Okay. I think maybe for Eastern leaders, maybe Chinese or Taiwanese leaders, they need to realize that, Westerners, they actually expect you to be explicit in terms of communication. So maybe in the East, it is better to leave some important information back in the context, but you need to be more concrete when you communicate with Western employees. And it would be also better for you to develop some kind of system. So you cannot hide everything inside your mind. You need to translate them into something that others can understand. So sometimes I think Chinese leaders, Taiwanese leaders, they do a lot. So you can see from this research article, the sales do more leader, they are more ideal. So I think that gradually becomes Chinese leaders' habits. So they may have something really great in their mind, but they do not try to say it out loud, say it, try to communicate these good ideas with others. So I think that would be some things that Chinese leaders really need to be careful when they interact with Western employees.
Great. I think the focus should be heavily on, if we look at two cultures being a Venn diagram, we first should be looking at the part that's overlapping. How are we alike? We all have the same heart, basically. If I look at our genetic makeup, the three of us, it's about 99.9% the same, us as humans. So the things that we have in common, the heart, that we all need love, that we need affection, that we appreciate gratitude, there's humility, and all of these, what I call these universal concepts that we have, are deep within all of us, and that makes humanity. So let's start with this, the building the bridge between cultures, between organizations, and even political, in the political sphere as well. And only then can you begin to, after there's a common base, do you begin to think about, well, how are we different, and how do we contrast and compare to each other and complement one another, and looking at it that way, Question for you, Eelco. In your work specifically, you work with at the firm level on teaching, ethics and financial ethics at different universities. In your work, Eelco, do you see that is there a different type of behaving ethically different in, say, manufacturing versus finance?
I think, thanks for that question. There's one particular difference between finance and producing industries, and that is that in finance, we have this notion of fiduciary duty that permeates the whole of the industry. And that means, what I mean to say by that is that we work there, in finance, we work with other people's monies and other people's risks, which is something else than I produce phones or pens or tables, and I try to sell them. Mm-hmm. And so this fiduciary responsibility is a heightened responsibility, which requires a heightened level of care. And so that is particularly different, I think, in finance versus in other industries. Which the awareness is in my observation not high enough. Mm-hmm. In the sense that people feel that they work for a bank or they work for an investment management company, and they associate themselves with their jobs and so on, but they not necessarily do they realize that they are playing with people's futures, and so on.
On the other hand, I could argue, manufacturing has that too. If I'm producing games for children, I have a duty of care, but it's at a higher level. If I'm producing games for children, I can't use, for example, paint that has chemicals in it, harmful chemicals. And that's already being regulated, and it is highly regulated at the very, very top. It's not at the individual worker level. It's being regulated at really the foundation of the firm, where I think the fiduciary responsibility goes down between, a client manager and a client, where there's a lot of room for interpretation and abuse.
But if I buy a game and the game doesn't function very well, I can go back and claim guarantee. I can get another game. Mm-hmm. I can hold liable based on rules. Right. And what we see in finance is that the investment product which doesn't perform well is not the investment fund, for example, or the checking account is not something you can return. You can't get a new one. Yeah. You can't claim guarantee.
Right.
And the rules are oftentimes not clear, in the sense that you can't describe all behavior that you need to see. And so instead of relying on rules, we need to rely on principles, which goes back to what Professor Wang has been presenting on Taoism. That's why these principles of humility, for example, are so important, in leading these kind of companies, because they are even more necessary in some industries than in others. And that is, I think, one of the key lessons
Good
here
point.
as well.
There's another, thank you for that. That's a very good insight. There's another great question that just came in. It says, there's a lot of emphasis on Taoism. How about Confucianism or Buddhism? Don't you think that the latest that have also they also have a deep roots and influence on mainland China society and culture, and thus leadership styles?
Yes. So I would say in the field of leadership, Confucianism is actually the one that mentioned the most. So I would say like this. So both Confucianism and Taoism, they are very important. And if things are good, and if you do it really great, you make money, then maybe you would like to follow Confucianism because it's a positive thinking. But right now, if things are not so good and you need to think about the meaning of life, then Chinese people will turn to Taoism. So basically, you can understand this like that. So both of them are very important. And actually, for example, there is a concept called paternalistic leadership. That's a mainstream Chinese leadership theory. And I would say the basis for this most likely Confucianism. But in this research, I focus on Taoism because it is related to humility, and humility also have a roots from Taoism. So right now, I would say probably 80% of the leadership research on Chinese leadership styles, they focus on Confucianism, and maybe less than 20% is about Taoism. And it is very difficult to conduct a research based on Buddhism. So I would say right now, maybe less than 3% of the scholarly research is about Buddhism. But maybe it would actually provide wonderful insights for Chinese leadership. And that's wait and see.
Great. Thank you. I'm cognizant of the hour. We have promised our audience, by the way, we have almost 2,500 people attending today's event, which is a quite it's humbling to be here on the screen for all of us in front of so many important people. I do want to mention, and before we go, that CEIBS actually offers something called the China Immersion Programs for organizations and firms, that we help them grapple with these understandings for Chinese firms that are trying to do business in Europe, and for European firms that are trying to do business in China, to understand these types of questions that we're having today in a very sample, in a short hour. We can put this together for you and your firm if you are interested. So if you're interested, let us know. We can provide more deeper training and customized training for you, whether you're based in China or in Europe or in Africa. Dear audience, thank you so much for attending. Professor Wang, thank you so much for sharing your insights of your research. Eelco Fiole, thank you so much for the comments. Wish you all a great afternoon.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, dear, both. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.